We often think of our homes as a fortress, a place where we feel the safest and the most at peace, where all conflict of the outside world stops at the front door. But what happens when you unknowingly invite your biggest enemy into your fortress of peace, giving them the opportunity to destroy you from the inside? Today, we will be taking a look at the unsolved murder of Helene Joyce Anderson, also known as Nikki Anderson, and Adrienne Hale, which took place in January 1986 in Bremerton, Washington. But if you're new here, hi, my name is Devin, and welcome to Kept on Ice, a true crime podcast where we focus on cold and unsolved cases. If you find cases like this interesting, please consider subscribing or following this podcast. I would also like to extend a trigger warning with this case, as we will be discussing the murder of a very young child. And I just want to be honest with you that some parts of today's case are going to be very hard to hear. So please keep that in mind as you listen to today's episode. So Helene Joyce Anderson, also known as Nikki Anderson, was born on October 15th, 1958 in Indiana. And while Helene was her given name, she primarily went by Nikki, and I will be calling her Nikki for the remainder of this episode. And she was described as a beautiful young woman with a smile that radiated in every picture I found of her. I wasn't able to find much information on her childhood or early life, but I do know that Nikki has been described by her friends as a reliable, responsible, hardworking, careful mother who was devoted to her two children. And I quote, "To know her was to love her. She was like smelling the earth after a good rain," end quote. So while Nikki primarily lived in Indiana for most of her life, in the early 1980s, she decided to move to Bremerton, Washington with her boyfriend, Kenny Hale, who was in the Navy at the time. Now, if you're unfamiliar with this area like I was, Bremerton is a small city in Washington state known for its naval base and shipyards. And it sits on the Kitsap Peninsula, just an hours-long ferry ride from downtown Seattle. Once settled into their lives in Washington, Nikki and Kenny would go on to have a beautiful baby girl named Adrienne Hale, and she was born on November 9th, 1981. And Kenny has said of Adrienne, quote, "When she was 2 years old, she was able to spell her name, Adrienne. Tears would just roll down my eyes that my baby was able to spell her name," end quote. Furthermore, he stated, quote, "She was her own little person with her own little attitude and personality, and I'm just awed by it," end quote. Shortly after Adrienne was born, Nikki and Kenny actually decided to part ways romantically. But by all accounts, they remained very good friends, and they were great co-parents together. And Kenny spent a great deal of his time at Adrienne's house, which was a duplex in East Bremerton on Magnolia Drive. As the years went on, Nikki got a new job as a cook at Arby's to support herself, and she would go on to meet somebody new, another Navy man by the name of Otha Tucker. And she and him would later have a beautiful baby boy named Marcus. By early 1986, baby Marcus is less than a year old, Adrienne is 4 years old, Nikki and Otha are engaged, and the entire family is getting ready to move to San Diego, California by the end of January. Nikki's fiance, Otha, had been stationed at a naval base there, and the couple were getting ready to move all of them to San Diego. And by all accounts, Nikki was extremely excited about this move, and she was ready to begin her new life with her fiance. However, Nikki and Adrienne would never be able to make that move and start the next chapter of their lives, as on the evening of January 29th, 1986, Kenny had spent the evening with Nikki and Adrienne at Nikki's home on Magnolia Drive, which was a pretty common practice for them because if you remember, by all accounts, Nikki and Kenny are great co-parents even though they are no longer together. And as Kenny prepared to leave the house at around 8:30 p.m., Adrienne asked him if she could spend the night with him instead of staying home with Nikki. As it was a school night and Adrienne was scheduled to go to preschool the following day, Kenny denied her request to stay with him, but promised to come by the following day and spend more time with her, as Kenny and Nikki lived relatively close to one another. So Kenny left Nikki's home, waving goodbye at his little girl who was looking out at him through the front window of the duplex. The following day, January 30th, 1986, Nikki was expecting some movers to return some furniture that she had purchased in preparation for her move to San Diego. However, when the movers showed up to pick up the furniture, she didn't answer the door. And after a few minutes without Nikki answering, the movers wrote a note and left it on the door, telling Nikki to give them a call later. However, before leaving the residence, the movers actually went to Nikki's neighbor in the duplex, a woman named Pam, to let her know that they were concerned because they heard a baby crying so loudly that it worried them. And according to the movers, in response, Pam simply nodded and closed her front door. Throughout the day, some other people also came to visit Nikki at her residence, but she never answered the door. Later that same evening, as promised, Kenny returns to the Magnolia Drive home, ready to see his daughter and have a fun evening with her. He too knocked on the door, but Nikki didn't answer. And while waiting for her to answer, he sees that there are several notes tacked to her front door. And after a few minutes with no answer, Kenny decides that Nikki must be out and decided to write his own note to her. So when the movers left earlier, they left a note on Nikki's door stating that she needed to get in contact with them or there would be legal consequences. So Kenny takes that note off the door, flips it over, and writes his own note on the back, stating, quote, "Hey, you better call these guys. I stopped by around this time," end quote. And then he sticks the note back on the door and begins to leave the residence. However, as he turns around, he hears a very unsettling sound coming from within inside the house, and it's the small cries of a baby. And this startles Kenny, as there's no way that Nikki would ever leave her baby home alone. He then goes back to the door and turns the knob, and surprisingly, the front door is unlocked. And Nikki never left her doors unlocked. And as he starts making his way into the dark house, he trips. And as he regains his footing, he looks down and realizes that he had tripped on the leg of his 4-year-old daughter, Adrienne Hale, who lay dead in the front room of the apartment. And just a few feet away lay her mother, Nikki Anderson. As Kenny stood there and the reality of what he had walked into started to sink in, he again hears the cries that brought him back to the house. And it's Marcus, crying in his playpen. And it would later be revealed that Marcus had been locked inside that house with his mother and sister's body for almost 24 hours before anybody found him. Kenny then grabbed Marcus out of his playpen and ran out of the house to a neighbor's house to call the police. Police arrived to the scene at 9 p.m. on January 30th, 1986, and also found Nikki and Adrienne's remains in the front room of the apartment. They had both been strangled to death, and Nikki had also suffered blunt force trauma as well as other injuries that have not been disclosed to the public. It was estimated that Nikki and Adrienne had been dead for at least 18 hours before the police arrived. Thankfully, baby Marcus was alive and unharmed, but a couch cushion from the living room was found in his playpen with him, and it would later be discovered that his mother's blood was actually on him in that playpen. The house showed clear signs of a struggle, but there was no forced entry. In fact, the front door was unlocked when Kenny arrived, but the back door was locked as usual. Based on the blood spatter and the arrangement of the house, it became clear to investigators that Nikki had attempted to fight her attacker and suffered some kind of injury from an edged weapon. And it is believed that this injury is what led to Nikki's blood being found in various locations around the home. Based on the lack of stolen items from the home and the lack of forced entry, it is believed that Nikki knew her attacker, as her friends described her as an extremely careful mother who would not open her front door to somebody that she did not know or trust, and would only open the door if she were expecting you to come over. Despite the clear struggle, nothing from the home seemed to have been stolen. And as investigators began taking witness statements and conducting interviews, they found that, very surprisingly, nobody in the entire complex seems to have heard the struggle taking place at Nikki's home, especially as the walls of her 1986 duplex were extremely thin. Specifically, Nikki's neighbor and friend, only identified as Pam, claimed she never heard anything the night of the murders, despite sharing a wall with Nikki and previously hearing every time the babies cried before that. Throughout the investigation, Pam stated that the baby cried at times, but that was nothing new. And according to her, if she had heard screaming or some kind of struggle, she would have said something, which I just personally find these statements a little bit suspicious, because you're telling me you heard every single time the baby cried next door, but you didn't hear the very clearly brutal murder that took place next door? You didn't hear that? And while I'm willing to give you the argument that maybe Nikki didn't scream to not wake up Adrienne, but I refuse to give you the argument that Adrienne, a terrified 4-year-old, wouldn't have screamed. Now, speaking of Adrienne, it is believed by investigators that she was asleep down the hall when the attacker first entered the home, and she was woken up by the sound of the attack. It is believed that she then went down the hallway to see what was happening, and based on where her body was found, it is believed by investigators that she was trying to run out of the front door, but she didn't make it. And without a doubt, Adrienne is the most heartbreaking part of this case for me, as of course she's a child, she's only 4 years old, but also because she almost wasn't there that night. She asked Kenny if she could stay with him instead, and he told her no. And while this is a perfectly reasonable and normal decision to make for a parent, Kenny has said that this decision haunts him to this day, which is incredibly sad to me. And my heart really goes out to Kenny on this, because you made a perfectly reasonable decision and you do not deserve to live with this guilt or this pain. It is not your fault in any way, shape, or form. In the immediate aftermath of the crime, the case did not receive much media attention at all, especially considering it was a very brutal double murder, a double murder that included a child. And the case went cold rather quickly compared to other cases at the time. A few articles were published in the early stages of the investigation in a local newspaper, but in my opinion, there was not nearly as much coverage as there should have been for a brutal double murder. Again, a double murder that included a child. Detective Garland, the lead investigator on the case now, said that he feared the killings, quote, fell off the pages of the newspapers rather quickly, end quote, at the time because, quote, Nikki wasn't a white, blonde-haired cheerleader type. That tends to get more media coverage than a single mom and a woman of color, end quote. He continued by saying, quote, sometimes you can't help but bring in the color barrier. Sometimes I look back and say, what if that had been a white 4-year-old child? Would they have put in a little extra effort behind the investigation? End quote. And I agree with you, Detective Garland. After the first several weeks of investigating, the case completely fell off the radar of investigators for years until it was reopened in 1993, only for that renewed effort to also fall flat. Over the years, several people of interest would be looked into for the murders of Nikki Anderson and Adrienne Hale, and this case would be re-examined in 1993, 2003, 2009, and 2019. But despite this, the case remains unsolved to this day. However, over 30 years after the murders, there seemingly was a breakthrough in the case. In 2018, 32 years after the murders, the robe and nightshirt that Nikki was wearing the night of the murders was processed for DNA and came back with a strong, unknown male DNA profile around the neckline of both garments, as well as the shoulders of the clothes. They were also able to match this DNA with other unknown male DNA inside the house where Nikki and Adrienne lived. Now, this is important because both Nikki and Adrienne's cause of death was ruled to be manual strangulation, meaning their attacker used their hands to kill both of them. So, if there's a strong male DNA profile around the neckline of Nikki's shirt, there's a strong possibility that that DNA belonged to her killer. However, this would be another dead end in the case, as upon further testing, it was discovered that the male DNA in question belonged to baby Marcus, and he would later have to be tracked down and have his DNA tested so that investigators could exclude his DNA from the house. And I'm sure that was extremely frustrating and potentially even devastating to investigators because I'm sure they thought they found it. They found their break in the case. They found their thing that was going to solve this 30 plus year cold case, but it wasn't it. But since that almost breakthrough in the case, investigators have collected at least one unknown male DNA profile from within the home and have been actively soliciting the names of people in Nikki's life whose DNA has yet to have been compared. And investigators have expressed that if they could just get one name to compare the DNA to, that might finally be able to bring this horrific case to a close and bring Nikki and Adrienne's families the closure they so desperately need. So now we're going to get into some suspects and some evidence that was collected at the initial investigation back in 1986. And the first piece of evidence I want to talk about, which kind of sounds like a messed up way to say it, but that's baby Marcus. He was left unharmed, and there was even evidence at the crime scene to suggest that he had been moved into his playpen after his mother and sister's murders. But why? This killer is seemingly so cold-blooded that they can strangle a 4-year-old to death, but moves a 1-year-old into his playpen after committing said brutal murder. And I listened to an interesting perspective on this from the Washed Away podcast. They also have an episode on this case, and their episode actually features a conversation with Detective Garland. So I'll leave a link to that below. Please check them out. But they mentioned that a possible explanation as to why Marcus was left unharmed is because as a 1-year-old, he wouldn't be able to identify the person who killed Nikki and Adrienne. They theorized that Adrienne was potentially old enough to identify the killer, even if she didn't know their name or could give police exact descriptions. If investigators are right and this person is known to Nikki, there's a strong possibility that Adrienne would at bare minimum have been able to identify the link between that person and Nikki. Either way, this aspect of the case is just so chilling to me because, again, you brutally strangle a mother and child, and then you have the audacity to pick up that child and put it in its playpen after you just murdered their mother. Again, It's moments like this in this case that show me that this killer is beyond evil. Another piece of the puzzle in this case is the lack of forced entry, and that seemingly no one heard Nikki or Adrienne screaming during the murders. And this piece of evidence is specifically why I agree with the investigators that Nikki and Adrienne knew whoever came into the home and killed them. Several of Nikki's friends and family have stated that she would not have opened the door for somebody that she didn't know late in the evening. And it is my speculation that because of that fact, someone that Nikki knew and potentially trusted came into her home, murdered her, and then murdered Adrienne because Adrienne would have known who they were. And the last piece of evidence I want to talk about is the means by which Adrienne and Nikki were killed. Both Adrienne and Nikki were killed by means of manual strangulation, meaning no mistake was made when killing them. Research shows that it can take 3 to 7 minutes to strangle someone to death. And while that might not seem like a very long time, it is absolutely enough time to realize what you are doing and stop, especially when you consider this case where you strangled a mother to death and then turned around and did it for a second time to a child. And strangulation is an incredibly personal and violent way to kill somebody because you literally watch the life leave their face and you watch them die. And killers who specifically strangle their victims to death shows a lot about their psychology because in their victims' final moments, they want to exert complete and utter control down to whether or not you live or die. That is the kind of sick individual we're dealing with. So now that we've gone through some of the evidence that was collected and released to the public, let's get into the police investigation in this case. So when the investigation first launched, as many of you can imagine, Kenny Hale was posed as suspect number 1. And in all honesty, that is standard operating procedure, as he has a close relationship to both of the victims. He is the one who found the victims, and his alibi kind of sucks, as the only alibi he has is that he was home alone watching TV. And another fact to consider, especially at this time in the late 80s, fathers murdering their children or even their entire families wasn't exactly uncommon anymore. And so while I can acknowledge all of these factors that would present Kenny as a very likely suspect, as the case goes on, it is my opinion that the initial officers simply wanted to pin a murder on an innocent Black man. And they wanted so badly to put Kenny behind bars that they did not do an adequate investigation in this case. And I say this because Kenny cooperated with police from the very beginning. He gave them the shoes and the clothes he was wearing that night. He sat for several police interviews and never gave conflicting accounts or information, and was always honest and consistent about the last time he saw Nikki and Adrienne, and what led him back to the house the following day. In one interview, according to Kenny, investigators told him, and I quote, "You know you did this. Just admit you murdered your daughter and murdered Nikki," end quote. And in my opinion, the motive, and I use that term very, very loosely, that investigators were giving Kenny for murdering his ex-girlfriend slash co-parent and his child is that Nikki was getting ready to move to San Diego with Adrienne. And if they left the state, Kenny was going to have to start paying child support for Adrienne. And not only were they saying that the child support was the motive for the murder, which, and I quote, look like clear motives for someone to do a heinous crime like this, end quote. I'm sorry, but that has to be one of the dumbest explanations for a murder I think I've ever heard. This man chose murder over child support when there is zero history of violence between Nikki and Kenny and Adrienne. Does that make any sense to anybody else? Moving on. Despite completely cooperating with law enforcement, Kenny was not believed. And in the end, he actually agreed to take a polygraph test so that investigators would finally believe him. But Kenny's friends and family were adamant to not sit down and take this test. But Kenny didn't listen. And as Kenny is sitting down to take the polygraph test, there was a knock on the door, and someone alerted him that his attorney was there and that he was not going to take a polygraph test that day. And should the police need any additional help or statements from Kenny, they would need to go through his attorney. And after that interaction, Kenny left with his attorney. And I'm sure you're wondering, girl, what attorney? Well, Kenny's family got him an attorney behind his back because he was refusing to listen to them. And the interesting thing about Kenny getting an attorney, in one of the interviews I watched in preparation for this episode, the detective says that Kenny asking for an attorney was suspicious. And it was suspicious that Kenny was putting up roadblocks for the investigators. Thus, he must be being untruthful in some way. And again, this statement is utterly ridiculous to me because this man has already sat down with multiple interviews with you all, agreed to take the polygraph test, gave you guys his clothes, gave you his DNA freely. But because his family was like, we see the writing on the wall, even if you don't, now you're saying that that's suspicious. He did 9 things right, but that 10th thing he did wrong, and now it's all suspicious. Cool story, bro. Got it. And Kenny has actually said of this incident, quote, "After I walked out of the police department that day, I didn't hear anything from the Bremerton Police Department until like 10 years later," end quote. Again, despite the fact that this man had done nothing but cooperate with the police investigation since the first day. But also, this is why every defense attorney will tell you don't speak to the police without a lawyer present, and you shouldn't. You have a Fifth Amendment right, but it only works if you use it. And I fully understand why Kenny spoke to the police freely, right? Kenny's thought process is, well, I didn't do anything. So of course I'm going to talk to the police. Of course I'm going to give them my clothes. Of course I'm going to give them my DNA. Of course I'm going to sit down for a polygraph test. Of course I'm going to do all of that because I didn't do anything. And if I give them all this information, we eventually will find out who did. And Kenny himself has said that he was very naive at the time when it came to the justice system, despite being an adult Black man in the 80s. But unfortunately, if his family didn't get him an attorney, I fully believe that police were getting ready to make him the one who did it. Especially if they're going out of their way to say that you invoking your rights is suspicious, they are grasping at every possible straw available. And of course, investigators didn't know this at the time, but we would later find out that the DNA found on Nikki and in her home completely ruled out Kenny as a suspect. But going back into our original timeline, police are convinced that Kenny is the one who killed Adrienne and Nikki. But they have to pretend to do an investigation and look at other leads. So as part of this investigation, they go and talk to Nikki's duplex neighbor, Pam. That's right, we're circling back to this woman because, in the words of Emily D. Baker, I have questions for you, Miss Pam. So reportedly, Pam knew before anyone else that the baby had been crying all day. But she didn't say anything or go next door and check on Nikki. And this was especially weird to investigators and to me because people around the neighborhood said that Nikki and Pam were friends. However, in Pam's interviews with police, Pam described their relationship as acquaintances and not very friendly with one another, just neighbors. And when she's asked as to why she was so nonchalant when the movers told her that they heard the baby screaming, she states that it was normal for Nikki's children to be, quote, fussy, end quote. So she didn't think much of it. Now, as somebody who has lived next to people with small children and newborn babies. I would notice if my neighbor's newborn suddenly started screaming all the time. There's a decent amount of screaming that newborn babies do, but you're telling me that you heard that baby screaming all day and didn't even just go over to complain when you share a thin duplex wall? So when police continue to question her because they're like, that doesn't make any sense, she then states that she didn't hear anything because she had an ear infection. And if she was sleeping on the quote unquote good ear, then she wouldn't have heard the brutal murder that took place next door. When she is again confronted with the fact that that doesn't make any sense, she then adds that she might have taken nighttime medication that would have made her extremely drowsy as well. As the interview continued, Pam walked investigators through her evening and actually claims that she was the last person to see Nikki alive after Kenny had left at 8:30 p.m. And Pam says that she never saw Kenny, and Kenny says that he never saw Pam. And the last suspicious thing that we're going to get into about Pam is that when police arrived on scene, she never came out of her house, even though she was home. And she was not interviewed until after Kenny got an attorney. And I understand that we do not have any evidence that this woman did anything to Nikki or Adrienne, but I just can't help but feel like her movements are suspicious. I just can't get over the claims that you didn't hear the murder that took place next door. That's going to be a hard one for me to understand. But as investigators are wrapping up their interview with Pam, they ask her if there was anybody in Nikki's life that would be looking to harm or hurt her. And Pam mentions a man named Antoine. Now, Antoine has been described as an acquaintance of Nikki's and actually visited her home on January 30th before her and Adrienne's bodies were found. According to Pam, Nikki was terrified of Antoine and did not want to be alone with him due to this fear. However, Nikki's other friends said that Nikki and Antoine had known each other for years and had a great relationship, and that Nikki had even given Antoine a place to stay when he was down on his luck. However, when police began to do a little bit of digging on Antoine, they find that he has a history of domestic violence with his ex-girlfriend. After finding out about this, police decide that they need to go talk to Antoine, as there is no physical evidence tying him to the scene, but there is no physical evidence excluding him from the scene either. And the police work even harder to find Antoine after they discover that a few months after the murders, Antoine was convicted of a sexual crime against a child around the same age as Adrienne. And this pushed him to the top of the list of people that the police wanted to talk to. But again, other than suspicious movements and unrelated convictions, nothing tied Antoine to Adrienne and Nikki's murders. And once DNA at the crime scene became available, he too would be ruled out as a suspect in the murders. And finally, there is Nikki's fiance, Otha Tucker. And he was quickly ruled out as a suspect as he was on duty in San Diego at the time of the murder. And the cameras on base, as well as several witnesses, confirmed that he was not in Washington at the time of the murders. And again, when DNA became available, he too was excluded. So you've heard me talk about DNA a lot in this episode, but we have to talk about the most frustrating thing about DNA in this case, which is in Washington state, where their DNA database is stored, you cannot test new DNA unless a person is paroled or deceased. People who are currently incarcerated cannot be tested against the DNA collected at Nikki's home. So it is very possible that whoever killed Nikki and Adrienne might be in jail, and we wouldn't know unless they were paroled or they died. And considering this case has remained unsolved for 40 years, I'm not convinced that this won't be the case. And this case is truly the stuff of nightmares to me because I couldn't imagine allowing somebody in my home who I trusted and they chose to violate me in the worst way possible. It's just so sad that this case has remained unsolved for 40 years. And for 40 years, Nikki and Adrienne's families have been carrying it with them. At the time of her death, Helene Joyce Anderson, also known as Nikki Anderson, was only 27 years old, and Adrienne Hale was only 4 years old. Nikki was so young, and she had so much to offer the world, and she had so much to offer her children, and she wanted to be an incredible and outstanding mother to her children. And she was described as the type of person that anyone would love. Adrienne Hale was a happy and beautiful baby girl, described as incredibly smart, with a little attitude that was all her own. Kenny continues to tell Nikki and Adrienne's story to this day. Quote, "It gets kind of hard to go back and relive the story, but as long as I got air in my lungs and I am able to tell their story, I'll keep telling their story until I can't tell it no more." And I said it earlier and I'll say it again. My heart really goes out to Kenny, who lost both his child and the mother of his child in one night. My heart also goes out to Marcus, who had to grow up without a mother or his sister and eventually learn what happened to them. I just truly wish every member of this family peace, and I hope that one day you will be given the closure of knowing what happened to Nikki and Adrienne. Detective Martin Garland from the Bremerton Police Department has worked at the police department for over 18 years. And not only has he worked extensively on this case, he grew up in Bremerton. So the murders of Nikki and Adrienne have a deeper meaning to him. If you have any information on Nikki and Adrienne's unsolved murder, no matter how small you think it is, please call Detective Garland at 306-473-5488. I would love to hear your thoughts on this case. As always, please be respectful in your conversations and give utmost respect to the victims. And that concludes our story today. I hope you have an amazing rest of your day. Please be sure to leave a like and comment down below anything you would like to comment down below. And be sure to subscribe or follow this podcast on your way out. It would really mean a lot to me. Thank you again for listening. Never underestimate the power of your voice, and I'll see you all in the next episode. Bye.